welcome in. We're going to get started here in a moment. While we're filing in, I'll take the time to introduce myself. My name is Kapili. I'm an admission counselor here at Pitzer College, and I also graduated from here back in 2019 with a degree in media studies and English. Thank you for the attention. I'll take a moment to introduce our three panelists here, starting with Professor Junisbai on the left. Junisbai is an associate professor of organizational studies and has been with Pitzer since 2016. She had a BA in international relations and geography from San Francisco State University, an MIS in information science from Indiana University, and a PhD in political science from Indiana University as well. Her recent courses include organizational theory, community of practice, authoritarian institutions, and Pitzer's Inside Out program. Junisbai has a forthcoming book entitled The Pitfalls of Family Rule. In the middle here, we have Professor Kizer, an assistant professor of sociology here at Pitzer, who started in 2017. She has a BA from Cal Poly Pomona, and her PhD is from the University of California, Irvine. Recent course offerings of note are sociology and its view of the world, sociology of the family, as well as race and ethnic relations, pardon me. And while I haven't had any academic interaction with Professor Kizer, I see her around campus all the time. On the right, we have Professor Bhattacharya, a professor of English and world literature, who's been with us since 2006. She carries several degrees, including one in international law emphasis from Chapman University's Dale E. Fowler School of Law, a PhD in English from the University of Southern California, an MA in English from the University of North Campus, and an AB in physics from Smith College. She's a practicing attorney and teaching a class on humanitarian immigration. As an English major, I had the privilege of taking literary theory with Professor Bhattacharya, which she hosted with Laura Harris. Please welcome our panelists. Thank you all for being here. So we are going to get started with a few questions that I'll direct the panel with, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Let's get started with, what is a typical Pitzer classroom like? Any of you can take the lead.
Go ahead. Can you start by saying there is none?
Yes, well, maybe you start.
Please.
I looked recently at my ratemyprofessor.com evaluations, and it called my class unconventional in a good way. So maybe there's just a range of ways that people teach. Most of our classes are small, and the relationship, community building in the classroom among students, and relationship with faculty, I think, are important. One of the things I love about Pitzer is this focus on not just theoretical knowledge, but on knowledge that's applied, and also knowledge that changes us, right? That in the engagement of what we do and how we are, how we interact with each other and the material, in that process we can be changed. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there.
I think Barbara said it really nicely, though. I would say there is no typical classroom. I echo everything Barbara said. I think a typical class, well, at least for my classes, are never boring. Like, I think maybe I'm, what's it called, biased, but I think that they're really interesting. And one thing that Barbara said about sort of not leaving knowledge in the classroom, I don't think, I don't know, I feel like learning that just for learning is cool, but I want us to apply it. And so a lot of classes do that. They provide opportunities for students to apply what they're learning outside the classroom, and I really appreciate that as well.
So yes, I do agree with everything my colleagues said. I started by saying there is no such thing as a typical classroom, because disciplines and students and the faculty, all of us create that experience in the moment, right? So it changes. We are not a lecture-based college at all, because large lecture rooms, they're good for certain kinds of communication, but you always need the follow-up with the individual person. I teach a lot of evening classes. So 3 hour long, once a week, evening classes, okay? And believe me, my students stay awake and alert and without caffeine, or sometimes with caffeine. They won't be yawning. But a big part of that is because they claim the space for themselves. And sometimes I have to assert my authority to say, hey, I'm the professor here. Can I get a word in edgewise? Those are the moments I know my classrooms have been really successful, when the students take the class away somewhere else. And I have to intervene to say, no, that was great. We now need to move to the next thing, which we do have to do. So.
I will say I was in Professor Bhattacharya's lit theory class, at 7 p.m. on Thursdays, and I definitely needed caffeine.
Yeah.
I'll move on to my next question. What makes a student stand out in your classroom?
I love curious students. I really love people that ask a lot of questions and are genuinely, earnestly interested in the subject matter. But also I really love it when people ask questions that like I've never thought of, or it makes me think about something in a new way. That's what makes teaching really exciting for me, is I get to be surprised, and so I love being surprised by people's questions.
I like students who are also curious, like Jessica said. I like students who care for other students in the classroom and who are caring about our community. I think the students that are most outstanding in my courses are the ones who both are immersed in the material but also think about the context that we're in. And like Professor Bhattacharya said, it's us in this space. We create the learning experience. So every semester it's different. And students who are careful to attend to that in the way that I try to be careful to attend to it, I feel like those students are like my comrades in the classroom. Sometimes, I think our education system focuses so much on mastery and performance and perfection. And when students come to college, that is the framework. I definitely had it. I'm working really hard to shed that. Instead of thinking about education as your own individual journey or your own mastery or your own display of perfection, right? I think that the most exciting classes are when the students can shed that and think about, well, how can I take a risk and how can I stretch myself in this space? I know that the stakes are high, right? Because some people want to go to graduate school or want to go to medical school, and I know grades are sort of ingrained in us that it's the most important thing. But I find my most successful spaces in our classroom is when we can challenge those assumptions and just really savor being together and savor what we learn about ourselves in the process, which I think I already said.
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues, but I if there's one characteristic of a student that I really, really find myself valuing over and over again, it's the willingness to take an intellectual risk. And I try to do whatever I can to, I teach 19th century British lit. If you never read Jane Austen in your life, you'll be just fine. And knowing that, I tell them, look, you're in this classroom, so you might as well read Jane Austen, because not reading it is not going to hurt you, but I can tell you reading it won't hurt you either. So go ahead, read it. Make what you can of it, right? And I try to structure my classes so that they're not worried that performance issues, especially for the science students or the social science students who maybe, just don't know if they'll be able to parse poetry properly. Let's park those anxieties that are about performance that affect your grade. What kind of intellectual risks are you willing to take with Jane Austen? I know that Jane Austen has already been zombified, but is there another monster you can see yourself reading into Jane Austen? Or something else entirely. And it's those moments when students come in with pre-scripted ideas about what English classes ought to be like, especially English classes that are, old fuddy-duddy literature. And then they make some kind of transition that makes this material their own and also creates a classroom environment where other people can engage with that. That's when I know, yes, I've done something in this young person's life, younger than me at least, still.
I have kind of a curveball question for the three of you,
Oh, dear.
inspired thematically by your responses, but in terms of risks, in terms of surprises, are there any in particular that stand out from the last year that you've experienced from your students? Feel free to be as specific or vague as you'd like.
In one of my classes, students research a social problem and they write a children's book about the social problem in which the characters realize that their personal trouble is not just a problem that they're experiencing, but something that other people in their community are experiencing as well. And so they write and illustrate it, and they also tutor kids. But one student wrote a book that rhymed, and like the entire book, and they asked if they could do it. I said, sure, why not? And it was really good. And I'm suspicious of rhymes sometimes. I don't know why, but sometimes rhymes can be cheesy, but it wasn't cheesy. It was really lovely and deep and really creative. And they drew it with crayons and colored pencils, and it was really nice. And that was different than how we were doing it. So I really enjoyed that. I thought that was really great.
Well, my colleague in English, Professor Harris, and I decided in the wake of, this was last year, in the wake of the pandemic and all of that, we were going to teach a class in which we were going to teach students how to let go of performance anxieties. Again, it's a literature class. If you don't read Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, you'll be okay. So take a risk. The big risk was let go, relax, just learn to enjoy life for this one class, okay? Don't worry about the fact that the class may feel loosey-goosey, no intellectual rigor. Do you guys remember there was this movement called lying flat? So can we learn to lie flat and still gain something from the process? So in the course of that, we taught an American lit short story. Many of you may be familiar with this, Bartleby the Scrivener. And this was so unexpected. We had two camps in the class. One group of students completely got Bartleby saying, I prefer not to, that it's this capitalist ethos that he's resisting, and he dies this sad death sorry, spoiler alert, he dies a sad death in jail. The other group, and this was really interesting, we had students with working class backgrounds who were outraged. Why is he giving up? Where is the ethic of hard work? And it was fabulous because we were not lying flat that evening, 7 to 10 p.m. And yes, some had caffeine. Yeah. We were in a knockdown, drag-out fight over Bartleby the Scrivener. That was a surprise, and that was kind of amazing, actually.
Great example. I guess a couple of things come to mind. So I have a student who is doing her thesis this semester on workaholism. And she was telling me how she came across this. She wanted to do this topic because all the women in her family are workaholics, and that she said that it really has had negative effects on her family. And so we were thinking always about what should a thesis look like. And it depends on who's your audience. Who do you want to reach? Who do you want to share your story with? And who do you want to connect with? And so she decided to do some presentations for different community groups. Some were charity and others were more like activist community groups, talk about workaholism and their experience, and just give a little short presentation on what she found, and then open it up so people could discuss it and think about ways that you could move forward. And then she presented her argument. And I really like that, taking a risk, because a lot of times people will write a thesis and it sits on the shelf somewhere. So her thesis was really in the moment, and even if it doesn't have a lasting artifact, it has a lasting impact on the people who are in that space. The other example is quicker. I teach org theory every fall, and our final project is to sort of assess or diagnose some issue or some organizational problem in our world, and then to come up with a reimagined future. And two of my students used our metaphors, or three of my students used our metaphors in class to think about organizations, to actually design a student organization for organizational studies, which we didn't have before. And now we're going to have our first organizational studies majors dinner, and we have like 60 RSVPs in 2 weeks, and they're doing programming across the year and bringing students together, which is really lovely. And then the final example I guess I'll give of something that surprised me that was a risk is I teach in the Inside Out program. I teach a class called College Inside Out, which is a way of that, like, giving students opportunity to deconstruct what college is. And again, the final project is like reimagining something about college. And two of the students in the first time I taught it, they wanted to criticize the Inside Out program, and they said, well, we don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth because we've really benefited from this. They're two incarcerated students, and I was like, this is what you should do. So they wrote a memo, a white paper, from their perspective, there's this thing called the BA Pathway Program, which is a program for incarcerated students to get their bachelor's degree from Pitzer in organizational studies. And they wrote a white paper about what, from their perspective, they needed to be successful. And then we presented it to the college and invited administrators, and I'd say all of the points that they raised, including getting a seat on Senate, were incorporated. And it made a big difference because, you know, their lived experience is different from the experience of professors, but also the administrators who design the program and implement it. So I think those are three examples I can think of off the top of my head.
All very thoughtful examples from each of you. Thank you so much for bearing with me on that one. I'm curious how, I feel like children's books especially can hold a lot of resonance in them. And it's always surprising to see how that resonance kind of comes through. And I also love the inception of organizational studies that's occurred in your classroom. Moving on, which classes have you taught that make you feel like a student again?
Actually, I'll start with that. This is not so much something I've taught, but I'm going to teach in the fall semester. So if any of you come to Pitzer, you'll have a chance to take it. I'm teaching for the first time in my life epics. I don't usually go that far back, but I'm not just sticking with the tried and true Iliad and Odyssey. I want to think about the ancient world as a global thing, and the interconnections, the amazing interconnections. And one of the things and I'm going to be very loose about my definition of what counts as an epic, because that definition is based upon, I found out, having done the research, a very, very kind of circular way of defining something. You look at the epics that are Western epics, and then you define the qualities of the epics based on those epics. So I'm like, okay, what else was happening in the ancient world, especially the things that I don't know? And I found amazing animal stories, right? Journey to the West from China, but then there's things from India. But then I also thought, what about cave art? Yes, it's not words, but it's painting. It's a way of representing the ancient world in what almost seems like narratives, right? So I've just been spending so much time reading this stuff. I think it's just going to be really fun teaching it, because I don't have any kind of mastery in it, other than I had 6 more months to read this material than the students who will be hitting the class.
Awesome, thank you.
I mean, all my classes make me feel like I'm a student. I don't think I have mastery in the classes, but not in a like self-deprecating way, but because there's always something new to learn. There's always new perspectives, new readings, and so I try to think about, like when I design my classes, I try to think about, if I was a student taking this class, like what would my experience be? So when I'm out in the world and like I listen to a podcast or like watch a movie, like if it to me like really applies to a class, I'll like make a list of that so I can incorporate it into the class later. So I don't think any of my classes are old and tired. And not because I haven't taught them enough, but because like I would be tired with them if I didn't constantly like tweak them and change them and make them better. And so I think of them as sort of ever-evolving projects, these classes.
I also feel like a student every time I teach. maybe I'll answer the question in a slightly different way. So I'm the first in my family to go to college, and college was like, oh, definitely, I didn't know that there was a such thing as a PhD. I know there are people who taught college, but I didn't know how they got to do that. So I struggled. I got my PhD much later in life, and I got this job much later than I got my PhD. So I got my PhD in 2010, and I didn't secure this tenure track job until 2016. So I've done various things in my life, and I didn't ever think that I would be here. So I think, like as Jessica said, I try to think of myself in the classroom and what would make me feel like I belong there. And part of it is playing, right? And part of it is being like, perfectionism is a good thing in many ways, right? It gets you ahead in some ways, but it closes off a part of you that you could be exploring. That's what I needed to hear when I was a young person. And so I try to design my classes in that way that lets people have that space to play. Not everybody wants to play, but we spend time thinking about things and trying to use different ways of expressing ourselves and not just in traditional papers. And then I try to think about the ways that everybody who comes here, no matter where you came from, you belong in this space, and what are your contributions, and what are your talents, and what are ways that you can stretch yourself, right, to grow. And I think those are all messages that would have resonated with me as a young person, but nobody said that to me. And so I think in a way my own journey was kind of circuitous because I didn't necessarily have mentorship. And so I try to do those things in my classroom, and I think education should be fun, and it shouldn't necessarily be about differentiating between the cream and everybody else, because that was what I hated about school.
Thank you. Along those lines, and another curveball question, but I'm not going to apologize for this one. What's a lesson that you've learned from your students that you want to carry with you in the future classes that you host?
Can you ask it that one more time?
Yeah. What is a lesson that you might have learned from your students that you want to carry with you into the future? And yes, I asked in regards to classes, but it also can be in terms of life or your teaching practice. What have you learned from Pitzer's student body in your time here?
I feel they're definitely not afraid to speak truth to power, and I always really like that. Sometimes I think about horrible things that happen in the world, and I think wasn't there someone there that said hey, we shouldn't do this, or hey, this is wrong, or hey, we should do something different? And so I always hope that my students will be the person that says no, we shouldn't be doing this, or this is illegal or whatever. And so they even do that with me, and I love that. Actually, because I like it because I'm not all powerful either. Right? So I don't think of myself that way. So I love it when they are brave and courageous and say something really uncomfortable to someone in a position of power that needs to be said. And so whenever I hear them do that, it always reminds me how important it is and how I need to keep doing that. So that's an important lesson. They do that much more here than other places I've taught, and so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Pitzer students aren't necessarily afraid to humble you, I feel like.
I mean, I can say something too. I mean, I was thinking, as you said this question, I was thinking about when I first started teaching at Pitzer, my very first semester. The first time I had to teach something outside of my area. This was the early British literature survey. I'm the 19th century person. I teach everything from the Age of Revolution, 1780s, on to, whatever, 20th century. There's a 21st century, I believe. But this was the early stuff, the really, really early stuff that starts with Beowulf and Chaucer and this and that. And I was out of my depth, and I was trying to be very correct and make sure I'm following the anthology because I knew I didn't know this stuff. And so I taught it the way I was taught in grad school, and the way I remember having that taught as an undergrad at Smith when I took that last century. And then I had about 5 students in the class get up and say, hey, do you realize this material this is like from the 7th, 800 AD, is really anti-Semitic? It had actually literally never occurred to me. Of course it is. This is the age of the Crusades, right? This is this time period in which people were emboldened and they believed that the Jews were horrible people, right? And all of this beautiful literature, on the one hand, had all these really awful anti-Semitic ideas kind of built into it. And my training in literature had taught me to look past that, right? To focus on the aesthetics, focus on what it's doing for the tradition of literature that came after, and to not pay attention to that. And I think that was such an eye-opening moment for me, that I, with the best intentions in the world, the way you're conditioned and trained to study the disciplinary discourse can create blinders. Hey, I'm great when it comes to seeing the colonial imperial stuff. But this early British lit material being encoding these anti-Semitic tropes, I didn't see that. And so that was great. It changed the way I taught from ever on. And that's also why I think that the ancient world is not one giant thing. It's something that we really, just one Western thing. It's something that really needs to be thought of in this sort of more global way. So, sorry, long-winded.
Please, no need to apologize.
When I started teaching here, I taught in a very different way than I teach now. And that has been in response to the things that my students have shared with me, sometimes definitely speaking truth to power, and sometimes just because Pitzer has a way of giving you space to evolve, right, and to grow and to do things differently. I was going to say something else. Yeah, so as a professor, sometimes you feel like and as a woman and as a woman of color, I used to feel like I had to really protect myself, and that these kind of criticisms that I got, that they could become an existential crisis for me, like, oh, they didn't like it, or I'll get back course evaluations, or that person is really challenging my authority. And I used to sort of hunker down and like feel, I don't know, like my walls would come up, right? Now I think, if I want my students to be open to feedback and development, then I have to also do those things. And so I have this little necklace that I got for my birthday this year, and it says linger. So what I've learned in my teaching that I apply to my life is that sometimes things can't be solved right away. Sometimes someone is challenging me in a way that is personal, but I don't have to take it that way. So I'm just trying to, this year, like really linger on problems and linger on questions. And then I can tell my students also, like, this can't be solved in one semester. We're going to have to sit with it. Like, this is a bigger issue than the academic calendar, right? The constraints of the academic calendar. And I think those are the lessons that I've learned, in this, is it 7 years? In this almost 7 years that I've been here. That has really actually changed my life. Oh, and the one thing I remember that I was going to say is that the classroom can be a space of real, breaking down barriers and really just, embracing your humanness.
I like the idea of lingering, linger in the discomfort. I think that really has space to breathe somewhere like Pitzer. And one thing that I've kind of gleaned from each of your answers, and you can feel free to agree or disagree, but a lot of what Pitzer asks is to consider the artist, right? Do not separate art from the artist, because the artist informs why this is here. I'll move on to my last question before we open it up to the audience. But who knows, I might have a follow-up question. So, how do you define success in your classroom?
I'll go first this time because I've been going last. I actually, in at least one of my classes, I ask us to define success together. So we spend time thinking about, what does an A mean for you as an individual? And almost inevitably, actually, almost all of my students' responses are about themselves and their A. And then I try to expand out and say, okay, well, what would an A for our class look like? What does that look like to get an A? How do you distinguish between an A and a B? And it's a good question to ask because we've never been asked that question, right? In education, someone else tells us what the answer is. So for me, an A is about risk-taking. It's about excitement and energy and possibility and trying something that's not safe, right, in that way. But also creating conditions so that people feel safe doing that work. And that's not just my responsibility, but it's our shared responsibility across the class.
In sociology, I teach things, or actually I challenge things that people accept as normal and obvious, like they've learned that their whole life, and then we come to my class and then it's like 18 plus years of socialization and stuff that we're learning that kind of challenges that. And so we only have a semester, and so I think for me, I think about what I consider success is an openness to considering different ideas that challenge without agreeing with them, but just hearing them, understanding them. And that's all I really want. That's all I can ask for is that, and that's all I really want is that openness for that possibility for growth in the future. And I think about you're kind of laying my dad would tell me it's oh, you're planting seeds. Sometimes I'm oh, there wasn't enough growth, this semester. My dad was you don't plant a seed and next day you're disappointed there isn't a tree, right? And so I think about that, and that this is sort of one semester in people's lives, and so I just want that openness.
So I've increasingly moved away from thinking of grades as a way of measuring or assessing students, because I think at the end of the day, it matters more where someone came in and where they end up. So I'm a literature person. I think in terms of narrative trajectories. So what's the story you're going to be able to tell yourself about the semester? Where did you begin? Where did you end? What was the middle, right? And I try to encourage students to have good middles, right? By which I mean, what do you do in the middle of the semester that then leads you to be able to do something and create a body of knowledge and be able to claim that body of knowledge at the end of the semester based on things that you've done, right? And I'm not evaluating you saying, hey, this or that was not as good as this other person's. Because some people come into my classes, they're English majors, they've taken tons of poetry writing classes. They're not afraid by the Grecian urn. And this is a reference to Keats, right? And then you get I get a lot of science people, a lot of STEM students. And they're like, is this the right answer? It's literature. It's okay. What do you think? You're asking me to think. I can calculate. I can't, And so where you begin and where you end in terms of your intellectual journey of recognizing that truth is not an absolute thing. It's constructed from language, and that language itself needs our constant attention and interpretation. This is what, English majors, this is what I try to teach in my English classes, that it's about language, it's about our getting not mastery of what this text means, but of what we can construct with our engagement, because we are in language, swimming in language, right? And so that's how I think of success. Did you learn that? What's the story you were able to tell? Is that an interesting story? At the end of the day, it's got to be interesting. Sorry.
Professor Bhattacharya, would you agree with the statement that the journey is the reward?
I would agree with it. I'm not sure my students would.
That's fair. Well, thank you all. I don't have a follow-up question, but I can brief us quickly on what the questions from the audience might look like. I'll ask that you raise your hand, and I'll choose from here. I'll point at you, and maybe I'll name your shirt color. And then panelists, I know that we've all, for each question, each of you has answered, but please don't feel obligated to give an answer to each question here. And again, thank you for bearing with me on this. Please feel free to raise your hand if you do have questions right up here in the gray. I'll also repeat the questions for the recording. So the question is, what do you do when you see a student struggling in your class? And how do you offer support in terms of writing? Is that a good paraphrase of your question? Totally. And what kind of writing support is available for students at the college?
I'll take that one, and then maybe you can. So we do emphasize at the college writing across the curriculum, recognizing that writing is a different thing depending on which discipline you're in. And we have an excellent writing center which is staffed with student interns. I'm not sure if they're fellows. Sorry, excuse me. That was the correct term. Student fellows, which creates a kind of camaraderie over the question of writing. I'm bringing in my assignment, this weird thing that some professor gave me. Here are my ideas. How would you, as a fellow student who's maybe more experienced with writing, guide me through making my ideas clear? And I think that's really valuable. But also, I think in the classroom, I know I do this. I've heard from other instructors, other colleagues as well. We're not really imposing a cookie cutter idea of what writing is, especially in the age of ChatGPT. I think we really want people to think, you do writing all the time. You probably have a blog, or they don't have blogs anymore, right? They have.
I think they exist at least.
Well, not for students, no. but they write. People write all the time. So how can you take those skills of communication that you use so easily and in such a relaxed way in your regular life, and think about audience and what you need to do to make that clear in print to a different audience?
Happy to take the next question if you'd like, unless you all have.
I mean, I can give an example
Totally.
of, so last semester I taught this class out in Ontario. It's it's called the CASA program. I don't know if you've heard about it. The students take two classes. One of them is it's a qualitative research methods class, and we work throughout the semester to do a community-based participatory action research project. So we have a community partner they do internship with, and they also do some research that the partner is desirous of. And so we do introduction, we do positionality, methodology, they do interviews and focus groups, and they write up their results, and they write a conclusion, and then they create some sort of artifact or some gift to the partner that they can use for their outreach purposes or for their advocacy. And in that class, we had the fellows from the Writing Center come and do peer reviews, and they were excellent. So the approach is that they're very well trained, but because they're peers, there's not that added assessment judgment. And they spent 2 weeks with us. They came out for 2 weeks, first to talk about about the framework, and then they actually did the peer reviews together. And the students said that was like one of the best parts of the class, right? And then I, as a professor, of course, can see that what's the first draft versus like what's the final draft, and there's definitely a big improvement. When students are struggling, there's different kinds of services. Students struggle in different ways. So sometimes I think I'll notice that students are struggling because maybe they're not coming to class, or they're not turning their assignments in. Other people sometimes just come straight to me, and our conversation is usually about what do you need to be successful, right? What kind of support can I provide to you, and can Pitzer provide? And then I see, many of us see our jobs as connecting students with those kinds of resources. Sometimes it's like the academic coach. I just need someone to help me look at all my syllabi and come up with a schedule for myself, and accountability mechanism, right? So, Yeah, there are supports and there is noticing of them. It's just that students will need different things.
Professor Kizer, would you like to tackle this, or should I move on?
Oh, I mean, the other thing I was thinking about is the first semester, students take a first-year seminar that teaches college writing, where they write 25 pages, and so that's a place where they also build up those writing skills. And then just to add on to Barbara's point about this, like there are institutional mechanisms. So when a student is struggling, the academic advisor will receive an email, and then that lets me know, okay, I need to reach out to the student and to see what is it that they're needing, and yeah, like what resources can I put them in touch with. So that's really helpful because I may not know what's going on in that student's other class, right? So that's a really helpful mechanism.
I think for my own FYS, it was a requirement for the letter grade to attend like 2 workshops at the Writing Center. So definitely resources available for students all over the place, and the Writing Center is an especially useful one. Next question, up there in the blue. All right, bear with me on this one. Question is, in terms of organizational studies, what is the balance between the theory and the application mechanics of the major? And then how does the applied function in the major?
And to what degree? So that's a great question. I think, so the first, we have, we've got different faculty, and so they do things differently than how I do them. For me, the joy and the promise of organizational studies is that students can start applying these concepts immediately because we live in organizations, right? So you have a family, you have your roommates, your suite mates, you have the student organizations that you're a part of. And one thing that is at the center of how we approach organizational studies at Pitzer is that means that you are both shaped by this collective and you have the power to shape it, right? So I think there's overlap with sociology in this way, and that is that we cannot ignore structures. We cannot ignore oppression. We cannot ignore centuries of colonialism and settler colonialism and imperialism. But when we learn those things, we can become paralyzed and think that there's nothing to be done, right? Because we're just one little tiny person. So organizational studies is about how do you reclaim that agency? I'm a firm believer in, one of the people who's really influenced me is Adrienne Marie Brown, and she always says small is all, right? So you start with your smallest circle, and you practice, and those things ripple out. So then it's not your responsibility for like changing the world on your own, but it happens in these piecemeal ways, right? And that you can build collectives that will act for change, including our students outside, right, who are protesting how worker treatment and really pushing for labor organizing here at the colleges. In the classroom, I also try, and I think my colleagues at Org Studies try to give opportunities for you learn this material and you don't wait to the end of the class to apply it, but you can do these applications throughout the semester. So I started doing something last semester, which the students resisted at first and then loved. And it was, I call them facilitations. And the question is, okay, up until we did 2 facilitations. Up until this point, you've learned all these things from org studies, but that knowledge shouldn't just reside in you. You should share it with whoever you want to share it with. So I said, okay, choose a concept or something, and then do something with it. Don't lecture. You have to do it with at least 3 other people. You can't lecture at them. You have to bring them together for some purpose. And some of the students, and so by then we talked about these various metaphors for organizations, domination, psychic prism, and politics. And the students did Zoom conversations with their extended families. I had a student who did a facilitation with his high school basketball team. And I had students like have dinner with their suite mates, and they would do these activities like, what do oppressive organizations look like to you, and what's our responsibility for, changing them into a different vision? What's your vision? And their job was to, I said, I'm putting trust in you. The only thing that you need to share with us in the class is just like for 10 minutes, tell us what did you do, why did you choose it, and what did you learn from it? And then they had to give me like a lesson plan, like what their plan was. And at first they were all like, Professor Junisbai, you're asking us to like go out into the world and force people to do blah, blah, blah. And what, 50 minutes? That's a long time. Or 50 minutes, that's not enough time. Or I can't possibly, I'm too busy. And then I remember in that moment, I was like, linger. I was like, okay. I'm having feelings in this moment. And I can tell you don't appreciate this and that you feel stressed by it, but go out and try it and just see what happens. And in the end, they really liked it. And then they were like, can we do another one? I was like, okay, let's do one more. So I don't know what the percentage what the balance is. There's I guess a qualification I have to make is that sometimes we are too interested in action. And we act without sufficient information. Or we act in ways that then dehumanize the person we're acting upon, right? And so there is also a danger in that, like the focus on acting and changing and doing and applying can have adverse effects. And so I would also like students to think about, like, is there too much action? Should we just lie down or whatever it is, right? And always doing whatever actions we take or whatever praxis we have to do it in community, right? Because sometimes the things that are so obvious to us as solutions actually can harm other people.
Piggybacking off of that a little bit, if I'm not mistaken, I think if students are soliciting participation from their peers or their community, I think they can apply for funding to further incentivize that participation as well, which is kind of nice. Next question, please. Up there in the maroon. So the question is, what kind of real-world projects can students take on at Pitzer in terms of humanities?
And research.
And
right?
research.
In terms of humanities?
And research.
Okay. So in terms of humanities, I've recently taught, this was last spring, I taught, this was kind of a opportunity that happened in the moment. This is not, doesn't happen all the time. I taught a class that's a social responsibility praxis class that was about helping a family that was fleeing persecution. And it was about helping them construct the narrative that they needed to tell in immigration court. But that meant students had to build trust with the family members. There were 3 adults and a couple of children. And get their stories and be able to retell the stories in a way that would be helpful legally. Because the way people tell stories is often, if you've ever tried to tell a story about something that happened to you, it's not going to be organized in a way that will fit some narrative template that you need to hit. So as a literature person, I tried as much as possible to get students to say, look, here's the raw facts, the plot, if you will. And then there is the narrative arc that we have to create. And then there is the genre of the legal declarations that the immigration court will want to hear. So think about applying what you learned in all your other literature classes to this real world example. And how do you read ethically in those classes matters in terms of how you interact ethically with these individuals and their stories, because there were distressing facts there. Literature's full of actual fictional literature is full of very distressing things. We can deal with that by saying, oh, that's just characters, they're not people. Now you have characters that are people. So how do you make sure that you're not just treating them as characters? So that's one of the things that I've done as much as possible. I'm not sure that I've done, well, my students had to do quite a bit of research. I did teach a different type of mass incarceration class a while ago in which I asked people not, these were students who were not going into the prisons. They were looking at our attitudes about, again, the stories we tell about mass incarceration that make us as a community and a culture willing to live with it, right? And one of the things I had them do and this is research because I actually wanted to know about this and I didn't have time to do it. So go to the courthouses nearby and just sit around and observe. Pretend you're there to attend as a jury member or as someone who has a court hearing. How do you navigate that space? What kinds of ways do people, and observe, watch the people around you and take notes, take data, as if you're going to write this up, use this as a story. And so those are ways in which I try to take the humanities and literary analysis we do with, fortunately, non-people, that is characters in novels that are just rhetorical figures, they're words, and then ask them to take that into the real world, but not treat people as characters, please. People are not characters. Do not psychoanalyze them like you would Jane Eyre. But yeah.
Thank you. We have time for about one more question. I'll take it from here in the front. So the question is, how do you keep students engaged in your classrooms? And then do you mind repeating the second part? And how is the larger purpose in the course or curriculum woven into each lesson? Great question.
When I design my classes, one of the things I think about is like in 10 years, if they were talking to someone about the class that they took, what would they say about the class? Like what would be the one sentence that they would remember? And so that's the thing I think is the most important theme in the class, and then I try to make sure that we're implementing that in each class. But I don't just do it, but I also have to say it, because I realize that like students won't know what you're doing unless you tell them why you're doing it and like your rationale. And sometimes I forget like, oh, this is like so obvious, like this is why we're doing this. And so I try to be super intentional about like what we're doing and why and how this ties into the larger theme of the course. And we start at the beginning like doing a review, meaning that they go, like I ask them like, what did we talk about last class? And to have them remember, I don't tell them, because when you remember, right, you're going back in your brain and doing this recall. And then we'll talk about that, and then I'll connect that to the different themes. And so how does this relate from our last class to this class and to the theme of the class? And so that's something I try to do every class at the beginning, and then at the end, in which we're looking forward to the next class. So that's sort of one way I try to do that.
Yeah, so I think, well, in organizational studies, this idea that there's an interplay between structure and agency, that's at the center of things. So I try to, as Jessica said, like, weave that explanation of why we're doing things. I find that, yes, everybody appreciates knowing why, right? And I think it's also important because it's not for a grade, and it's not just a thing that you do and you don't think about again, but it has a greater purpose. In the beginning of class, just as I say, like, well, this is what an A is for me, what would an A be for you, and what's an A for our community, I also say, okay, here are our objectives. These are the things I think are really important. I lay them out in the syllabus. But then there's a space also like, well, what is your objective? What do you want to create in this classroom? And thinking about, having spaces points throughout the semester. One thing I always ask students, like every once in a while, like at different points, pivotal points in the classroom, I'll say, let's look back at all the things that we've accomplished. And then I'll have like a Google Doc, right? And usually I have like a table and each student can take a little square and I'll say, what does this mean to you? And then we all in live write our little things and then people can look across it and we talk about, what are some commonalities and differences and like the meaning that we've made out of this, of what we've covered. And then I also often ask students, because sometimes I have these little times where they can just do a little reflection, they don't turn anything in, they just either write or think, and my question is often, why do you think I'm asking you to do this at this point in the semester? And sometimes they come up with these really brilliant things, and I'll be like, that's a great answer, that's not my answer, that's a wonderful answer. Right? And so just thinking like, why are we doing this now in this way? Why are we doing this? And also like, what are some alternative ways that we might be able to do it? And just as Jessica said, like thinking about in 10 years, what do I want students to remember? For org theory, our final project is write a letter to yourself in 10 years. What do you want to make sure what are the ways that what do you want to make sure are the ways you're being? What is the knowledge you want to keep? What are the things that you hope you'll be doing with it? And that's actually one of my favorite assignments, like, because people sometimes write, like, one student last semester was like, here I am sitting in the office, everybody's left, the lights are out. I find this crumpled piece of paper in my pocket. I'm like, oh, it's my letter to myself.
Oh my God.
And I then, when students also, like, at those points when they're troubled in the future, because, sometimes they become my advisee, if they feel upset or like they can't do something, I sometimes will say, pull out your letter to yourself and remember, like, how powerful you are. And I had a student who was like, I can't what my thesis and I was like, get your letter out to yourself. And so I think those are like also ways to co-construct meaning and like purpose.
I think I've increasingly started in the last, especially post-pandemic, I think things have changed in how I see my pedagogy. I've started focusing on pleasure, recognizing that not everyone's going to like reading everything. But even that unpleasure in the text is still asking you to think about what would have been pleasurable. Is it just the pleasure of the familiar and the nostalgic? Is this just too difficult for you? And so you're like, it's just too difficult, but it might become pleasurable if you just give it a few more times that you play with it. But before all this, I used to focus on, let's analyze this and let's see what's happening. What's the hidden agenda of this text? And I still do that. But I do emphasize the pleasure. And sometimes in those long 3 hours in the evening, when somebody has not brought enough caffeine and they're kind of dozing off, or I see several of them dozing off, I'll say, let's just read this out loud. And honestly, I'm looking at the young people here, the potential students. Let me tell you, when I ask someone to read this stuff out loud, they're like, is this even English? I don't know, it's a word. They're literally just spelling it out. Obviously, that's not how people read, right? And so I'll stop them and say, okay, I'm gonna stop you right now. That was really bad, wasn't it? Like, yeah, okay. So read it out like you mean it. What's the meaning here? Can you dramatize it? Get up and throw your arms around, do something, which also then gets some, the caffeine thing, it wakes them up a bit. But again, emphasizing the play, like my colleagues have said, and the pleasure of knowing something, of being able to deal with something that you couldn't deal with before. It's such a rush, and trying to emphasize that rush, that intellectual rush, when it happens, but not necessarily expecting it to happen all the time either.
Well, thank you all for such thoughtful answers. Please thank our panelists.